So now that we have a basic understanding of data and databases, which are built on tables, now what we need to look at is how do we move data from one location to another? Because as you recall, a database is simply software that allows you to interact with, store, create, and manage data that comes in the form of records and fields. So what if we want to move that information? For instance, here I've been looking at an Access database. What if I wanted to move this data to, say, my SQL server that my website is working off of, or I wanted to connect to this Access database if I had the right kind of server set up and pull the information from this database into my website or into a publication. Now, how would I do that? And the answer to that is that it uses a thing that's called XML, Extensible Markup Language. And Extensible Markup Language is a cross-platform software and hardware. It's a hardware-independent tool for storing and transmitting information. So it's not dependent upon a platform, a specific software, or a specific hardware in order to store and transmit information. It's a markup language, kind of like HTML, which is hypertext markup language. This is extensible markup language. The difference is that in HTML you have predefined tags. In XML you don't have predefined tags, which means that whoever is the designer of the database or the data really, have got to define your own tags. And those tags should be self-descriptive or semantic. And so what we've got here is, let's explore this a little bit. We've got this customers database. We already looked at the relationships between the different tables. Within the spreadsheets, you can also look at it in different ways. You might want to do a customer list. You might want to have a form that lets you enter details, etc. So there's a number of different ways that you can present that information outside of the tables that it's in, but it requires there to be a setup for that. And when we look up here, you'll see that there are database tools that you can use to connect to and external data tools. And so what I'm going to do is I'm going to take and I'm going to export this data from, and I'm actually going to close the customer list. I'm going to go to the customers table, and I'm going to export that to an XML file. And you'll notice that it's going to a file called XML because I chose XML. So I'm going to click that, and that will give us the ability to look at that. And you'll notice that it says what should be exported. XML is the data in a markup language, and then XSD, it's going to create a file, a schema that tells how to present that data. And we're not going to look at that for now, but we'll go ahead and export that data, and then we'll go and look at it. So I've gone to that file that we just exported, and I opened it in Internet Explorer. You can open it in any browser or really just about any kind of program that allows you to look at the text behind the scenes. And what you'll see is that this looks an awful lot like an HTML document would. It's got a document type declaration at the beginning, which is XML version 1.0. So I'm telling it what the data is, and then you see that we've got a series of tags, nested tags here that have been opened up. So let's look at this. First off, it starts with a data root tag, and then there's a bunch of properties of that particular one, but the tag itself is data root, and that opens here, and you'll notice that I was able to compress that. That contains everything in the document because that element starts here and it goes all the way down here. So this allows me to collapse that so that you can see everything that's contained in there. Now that's a nice feature in that it allows us to sort of break this down. And so the data that was exported from that sheet contains the data root, which is the containing element, and everything underneath that is a child. So the data root is it's the root one, and you can have one and only one root element, and everything else has to live inside that root element. It so happens that inside of that root element we have 3 instances, because I had 3 customers in my database, and we'll just look at one at a time. Within that customer, you'll see that there are a series of other elements that are included in there. So I've got the ID, which in this case is the primary key. It's not indicated here because that is a function of the software, not of the data itself. So we've got the ID, we've got the company, and you'll notice that these tags are semantic. In other words, they tell you what kind of information is going to be included in there. And the format of an element is you've got an opening tag, and then you have the data, and then you have the closing tag. Now, in the process, you can also have attributes of that. Like here you've got data root, which is the element, and it's got a number of other tags that are, or attributes that are included as part of that tag. This particular one doesn't include any attributes in there, but you could have said that this was, say, a text element, or number, or any of those other kinds of things, like generated equals, etc. So we see that again it's semantic. The first one is ID. That is the unique ID for that for that table. Company is the name of the company. So what you're doing is you're giving meaning to the data. Regardless of what data is inside of this element, it's going to be related to company. So if I come over here, again we've got the company tag here, but it's got different content, but we still know what kind of content that is because it uses the semantic markup. And you'll notice moving down here they've got last name, but they've got this special code in here. And the reason that they've got that special code in here is because when you start moving back and forth between different applications, sometimes you have to map that data to other places. And you may have noticed in the last video that I showed, sometimes it'll say last name, sometimes it'll say name last, sometimes it'll say L name. So there's different ways that people use for labeling their data, and what you need to be able to do is when you're moving to a new application, you need to be able to map that. So by putting that X0020, that's a unique identifier that Access is using within their database that gives them the ability to more easily map to other databases that might be using similar names, so that you can actually merge data from different databases in that way. And we're not going to get into that anymore, but that is the reason that it's not just last name, first name, because the ability to port that data to other applications, sometimes it is beneficial to add some unique identifiers within the tags, but again, we're not going to go any further into that. But they do use semantic tags, and each of these records use the same items. Now you'll notice that everything that it's transported here has a data value within it. So we've got mobile phone, home phone, and fax on this first record. In these other records, I only included one phone number, so it didn't send along the empty records. It only sent along those elements that had data within them, and that's just as an efficiency so that you're not transporting and trying to merge a bunch of data that doesn't contain any data. So you can have fields that are empty, but when you start transporting it, it's more efficient to not transfer empty fields. So the next thing to be clear about is that this XML in itself doesn't do anything except for providing structure and meaning to your data so that it has something to be housed into, so that it can be introduced into some other software. So if you were to look at this XML file, it doesn't really do anything, but you can have software that will go in here and it'll interpret the different elements here, and it can say apply that information into a proper location in a web page or in a style sheet or in an email or in really any application that you have that is able to parse XML data and turn that into content that is presented with that software. So just one last thing to touch base upon, and that is the idea of nesting. And again, we have our data root containing all of the rest of our XML data. Within that, we've got the customers. We've got 3 of them. Each of those are children of the data root, but within the customers, and you'll notice that customers starts here and ends here. So everything inside between that opening tag and closing tag, those are child elements to that customer. So the customers becomes the parent element, and you can see in this case when I close that, everything disappears. When I open that, everything that's inside of there, completely nested between the opening and closing element tag of customers, all of that is child data of that particular customer. So in this case, we've got the data root that is the parent. We've got the customers. In this case, there's 3 different sets of customer data. Those are children to the data root, and that customer data is parent to these elements, and those elements are children of the customer's data. When you are doing XML, there can be one and only one root element, and everything inside of there must be a child of that root element, and you can continue nesting further down in layers so that, for instance, if you had address within customers, you could have address, and then inside of that you could have street address, city, state, etc. So you can nest different layers of data with inside of others, and when it's done properly, you would be able to open and close it. In this particular case, I'm looking at the browser in Internet Explorer that allows us to open and close those so that you can see who the parents and children are. So in review, XML is a markup language that provides structure to data. It doesn't do anything on its own except for provide structure to that, so there has to be software that works with it. You must define your own tags, and they should be self-descriptive. The elements consist of an opening and closing tag, and in between them is the data. So opening tag, closing tag, inside is the data. There is a hierarchy that must be followed where you have got a root element, and then inside the root element you can have nested layers of data, and you can have multiple levels of nesting. Now the rest of it, we could look at XML just as we did data, and we could go into extensive detail about all of the different ways of using it, but this should be enough to get us to where we can use it as part of our projects.